Nuns normally stay in churches, praying, singing, and being a good servant to the Lord. But can a nun have another life other than the church itself? Definitely. Look, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Rosetta was not a gospel singer who people normally saw in churches that go full-on Whoopi Goldberg in the Sister Act. Instead, she was the Brian May type of nun, playing electric guitars before it was cool. In the 1930s and 1940s, this was the woman who showed up, plugged in her guitar, and laid down gospel tracks so fiery they could wake up the most dead-as-a-doornail churchgoers. Now, if you're wondering how she got away with it, being a woman in a genre and time that expected her to stay politely in the background, it's because she didn't care. She smashed through the idea that women, especially black women, couldn't play loud electric guitars. Oh, they tried to sideline her. All right. But her popularity was through the roof, and not in the polite applause at a Sunday sermon way. She was drawing crowds from all over, mixing in clubs and theaters with a whole bunch of secular audiences that had no business even liking gospel. Yet, they were there. This lady was doing what the supposed kings of rock and roll would get credit for in later years. Then came the collaborations that threw everyone for a loop. Sister Rosetta didn't stick to some church choir or a gentle folk group. She teamed up with artists like jazz trumpeter Lucky Millinder and swing bands, all while preaching gospel lyrics with that "I'll play it as loud as I damn well please" attitude. She brought her gospel roots right into the world of jazz and blues. By 1944, she released a single called "Strange Things Happening Every Day" that actually cracked into the Billboard charts, becoming one of the first gospel records to do so. Keep in mind, this was the same Billboard that usually featured mainstream, non-religious music, and she kept it coming. In the late 40s, she took under her wing another powerhouse, Marie Knight. The two started performing together, blending gospel in a way that made people almost forget they were supposed to be pious. Imagine going to see a couple of gospel singers, expecting some hymns, and instead getting a full-blown blues concert with gospel lyrics. If people weren't raising eyebrows at the fact that she was a black woman playing lead guitar, they were scandalized by the fact that her performances weren't church service material. She was loud, she was bold, and she could have probably outperformed half the rockers who came after her. As the 1960s rolled around, the music scene veered to younger rock and blues musicians, and Sister Rosetta was put on the side. But the irony here is that they were just following in her footsteps, ripping off her style, and claiming they invented it. Artists like Johnny Cash, Little Richard, and Chuck Berry all took pages out of her book. She spent her last years performing on smaller stages and even went back to her gospel roots, but her health started to decline in the late 60s. She died in 73. Sister Madonna Booter. Sister is known as the Iron Nun. She started going for fitness when she was 48. Guess what sport she chose? Triathlons. These races are designed to wreck people with perfectly good knees and lungs, but she wasn't called Iron Nun for nothing. Anyway, she starts racing in triathlons and doesn't stop at a few local 5Ks or even some marathons. Instead, she moves on to Ironman races. Now, an Ironman is for folks who think pain is a warm-up. It's a 2.4-mile swim, 112-mile bike ride, and a 26.2-mile run, back-to-back. Most would rather sit on the couch and watch TV, but Sister Madonna thought, let's go and suffer outside for hours instead. By 1982, she was hitting the Ironman circuit in Hawaii. No one else that age even tries this stuff. She just couldn't care less that her body had been around since before sliced bread was a thing. As if the over 45 Ironman races stat isn't enough, she's actually broken records as the oldest woman to ever finish an Ironman. This means that every time she crossed that finish line, she set the bar even higher for the next person who might want to be that oldest woman. Other people's grandparents are out there knitting, and she's out here doing a triathlon in under 17 hours. As she got older, the race organizers weren't exactly thrilled about having a 90-something woman out there in their Ironman events, which honestly sounds hilarious. They were basically worried they'd have to call an ambulance if she pushed herself too hard. But the Iron Nun kept showing up, making it clear that she had no intention of letting age slow her down. It got to the point where they had to extend the cutoff time just for her, because she was that determined to keep going, finishing every single grueling leg of the race. Now, she's 94 and probably lasts longer than you do. On the track. Sister Mary Kenneth Keller. Here's a Keller that can hear and see. A nun, of all things. She threw herself into computer science at a time when most people were barely aware of what a computer was. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Keller was right in the middle of things, getting her hands dirty with computational research at Dartmouth College. This was back when the boys at Dartmouth didn't even let women into their computer science labs. So, naturally, Keller just strolled right in, becoming one of the first women to break into that male-dominated tech dungeon. She went on to earn her PhD in computer science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, becoming the first woman in the US to do so in that field. It's like she saw the lack of women around and decided to make a point of it. Now, Keller didn't just play around with computers for fun. She was right there at the start of the basic programming language. BASIC, meaning Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. It was a programming language that opened up computers to the masses. Before BASIC, you practically needed a PhD in cryptology just to turn the damn thing on. Keller worked on this language to make computers more understandable to people without decades of tech training. BASIC took the crazy complex process of programming and made it a bit more accessible so that any idiot could get a computer to do something halfway decent without needing a degree or a punch card. So yeah, Sister Mary Kenneth was involved in bringing computers to the people, whether the people wanted them or not. By the time she was done, there were computer courses popping up all over the place, thanks to her programs and her influence on the education system. It wasn't like she wanted to make things easy for everyone, but rather, she recognized how freaking annoying it was to work with computers that practically sneered at you if you didn't know some obscure language. So, by the 1970s, Keller was setting up the computer science department at Clark College in Iowa, where she taught. There were no touchy-feely, inspirational sermons with Keller. She just laid it out, expecting her students to keep up or get left behind. Nun of Watton. So, it's the 12th century in England. There's this place called Watton Priory, a convent where young women are sent to live a holy life, shut away from the sinful world. Right in the middle of all that, there's a young nun, barely old enough to know anything about life outside the stone walls. This young nun ends up getting herself into a big scandal by hooking up with a lay brother, one of the guys from outside who helps around the convent. Back then, even looking at a lay brother was like a ticket to hell in the nun's eyes, let alone actually getting involved with one. The convent catches wind of the affair, and that's when things go off the rails. The other nuns weren't forgiving about this. Why do you get to be boned while we're out here praying and being good servants of the Almighty Daddy? The nuns went medieval for the punishment, probably because it's the medieval period. As soon as they find out, the fellow sisters get together and decide they've got to deal with this disgrace. They don't give her a talk, don't suggest confession, or anything remotely gentle. Instead, they get creative with some seriously twisted punishment. First, they lock her up. Then, they bring in the Clyde to her Bonnie and make him stand there like some kind of display model of sinful man. They're both forced to face what they did. The other nuns get their hands on this guy, and, deciding they're the ultimate moral authority, they castrate him. It's not like he had much say in it either, considering they held him down and did it in front of everyone, sending a clear message to anyone else with impure thoughts. For her part, the young nun wasn't getting off easy either. They made sure she knew exactly what her sin had cost this guy, like it's her fault alone. After the castration, they force her to carry the severed parts around, turning her punishment into some morbid display. They're making her physically carry around his ball. Then, because things clearly haven't hit rock bottom enough, they throw her into solitary confinement. They lock her away, isolated. Weeks pass, and she's still stuck in that cell, treated like the convent's shameful little secret they've got to keep hidden. None of her fellow nuns, the same people who are supposed to be her sisters, show any mercy. Joan of Leeds. Joan of Leeds was a nun in 14th century England who decided she had enough of the cloistered life in the quiet Yorkshire convent. Instead of wasting away her days praying, fasting, and wearing a habit, Joan had other plans that had more to do with getting out of the convent walls, and a lot less to do with God. She chose the path of carnality, leaving holy orders behind to pursue the kind of life the church probably didn't want her to know existed. She went through the trouble of faking her own death. It was the type of plan that involved crafting an entire dummy of herself, presumably to avoid anyone raising questions when they found her body. She left the convent folks with the impression she'd passed on. To her credit, Joan was cunning enough to think she could outsmart the entire religious order she'd once been a part of. She managed to make something that looked enough like her to fool the nuns, who believed she had genuinely died. How anyone bought that without a second thought says plenty about the level of dedication going around, as if these nuns had actually been keeping a keen eye on each other. So, she slipped away without anyone immediately catching on, managing to go unnoticed long enough to get as far as she needed to go. She didn't take long to start living in the way of carnal lust, as the records from the time kindly put it, which is the church's 14th century way of saying she was off doing things that would make most nuns faint. She had abandoned them entirely, And let's just say, nobody was under the illusion that Joan was off contemplating scripture. She was, by all records, living her life outside the convent like someone who had just tasted freedom and wasn't planning on going back anytime soon. The church didn't just sit back and watch, though. They put out a warrant of sorts, basically trying to track her down like she was a medieval fugitive. Sister Margaret Traxler. Sister Margaret was born in 1924, hit with a mix of religious fervor and a hot temper for social justice. The setup here was simple. She wore the habit, but she sure as heaven didn't act like most of them. She didn't sit around folding her hands waiting for God to fix things. She got herself a front row seat in the big American battle for civil rights, showing up right in the thick of things. By 1965, Sister Margaret actually marched. And not just any march, this was the Selma to Montgomery marches, alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself. She didn't do the whole, "I'll pray for you from a distance" gig. She got her boots on and marched right up to Alabama's racist ass, stepping into the fray with other brave souls demanding voting rights. Imagine the looks on those good old boys' faces when a nun, of all people, showed up with that determined glare. While she was keeping Alabama's finest on their toes, Sister Margaret also had a few choice thoughts about the Catholic Church itself. See, she wanted justice right under her own roof. She spent her life calling out the church's hypocritical nonsense, especially when it came to women's rights. Remember, the church wasn't exactly the feminist rally zone of the decade, but Sister Margaret, stubborn as they come, thought women deserved a voice, both in church and in the world. She decided the best way to deal with her frustrations wasn't to hide them, but to get some allies. So, she co-founded the National Coalition of American Nuns, an outfit that aimed to shove feminist ideals right into the heart of Catholicism. Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098, died in 1179. She was a Benedictine nun, which, back then, was basically a medieval way of locking yourself in a convent, avoiding marriage, and probably taking a vow to ignore 90% of society's nonsense. But what made Hildegard stand out wasn't that she'd spent most of her life in a convent, surrounded by cloister walls and wooden benches. No, she was something of a medieval multitasker. Hildegard was out there doing what a dozen other people would probably struggle to do, even with Google on their side. She started having visions. Now, to everyone else, that might sound like a fast track to a medieval mental institution, but for her, this was apparently no big deal. Hildegard claimed these visions gave her a direct line to the guy in the clouds, and she put them all down in a book called Civius, which sounds like an ancient disease, but is actually just Latin for know the ways. In it, she laid out every symbolic, mind-bending, borderline acid trip scene she claimed to witness. People back then thought her visions were basically like an IMAX screening from God, so no one dared say she was nuts. They were that impressed by her. She went on to compose music. You might think, oh, nice, church music, something to keep the Sunday masses alive. But what she wrote were chants were long, complex, and packed with scales that probably threw off half the choir. And if her melodies didn't blow their minds, her lyrics sure did. She wrote them in a way that was either pure genius or just plain impossible to understand without a translator. She called these compositions symphonia. Hildegard's music might have been one of the only things worth listening to at Mass back then, but that doesn't mean it's not a banger. Then she turned her attention to medicine. No stethoscopes, no sterile gloves, herbs, stones, water, and a lot of try this and see if you survive. She wrote Physica and Causae et Curae, basically a couple of how-to guides on what she thought could heal the human body. Her theories on cures were enough to fill a medieval pharmacy. She suggested fennel could make you happy, that honey helped with sore throats, and pearls were a remedy for something. We'll never know for sure. Not content with shaking up medicine and music, Hildegard decided to go big with theology too. She added 2 more volumes to her Scivia, Liber Vitae Meritorum and Liber Divinorum Operum. It talked about things like divine justice, virtue, and the nature of God, with all the intensity you'd expect from a woman who probably hadn't seen a town square in 20 years. Her theology, if you could get past the language and symbolism, was all about dissecting what she thought were life's big mysteries. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Born in 1648 in the backwater colony New Spain, which some genius rebranded as Mexico later on. Right from the start, she had to teach herself to read and write. Society? Busy telling girls to sit down and shut up. But Juana wasn't playing that game. By her teens, she was more learned than most adults in her orbit, and naturally, this ticked off every man with a pulse. She wanted books, knowledge, the stuff they kept locked up for guys only. She tried her luck at court with the viceroy and his wife, making herself known for her intellect. Didn't work, so she ditched the nobles and joined a convent at 21. She picked the convent of San Jeronimo and turned her room into a book lover's bunker, piling up every text she could find, sneaking in scientific stuff too. Instead of crossing herself all day, she wrote poetry and essays that dripped sarcasm. She pointed her pen at the hypocrisy choking her society, firing off Baroque verse like Hombres Necios, where she called out men for wanting saintly, obedient women while treating them like garbage. Then came that bishop who had the nerve to lecture her. Under a woman's pseudonym, the guy told her to quit thinking and stick to praying. Juana clapped back with Respuesta a Sor Filotea, laying out her right to learn and think without some cleric breathing down her neck. Yeah, the whole nun calling out a bishop thing didn't win her fans in high places. The church eventually made her give it all up. The books, the experiments, her work. They wanted her brain gone, basically. She spent her last days caring for other nuns during a plague that swept through her convent in 1695, after they'd stripped her of everything she'd built. They didn't see her as worth much outside of caretaking duty, so she worked until she died, because apparently, even dying wasn't her choice. Archangela Tarabotti, born in Venice in 1604, locked in a convent at 11 because it was just cheaper for the family than giving her a real shot at life. Back then, girls like her didn't get the luxury of a no thank you when it came to joining a convent. Her family forced her in because she had a leg problem, which somehow meant she was less likely to get married, so why not just shove her into a convent and call it a day? What could go wrong with trapping an intelligent, opinionated girl in a religious cage? Once inside, she did what most kids would probably do if they were thrown into something against their will. She fought back. Tarabotti started writing against the very institution that held her prisoner. And this wasn't polite commentary. She was pissed. She wasn't there for spirituality, and she sure as hell didn't keep her head down. Tarabotti's writings turned into open attacks on the whole system. She became the voice against the practice of forcing women into cloistered lives, and the nuns took this as a drama. Her first major work, Paternal Tyranny, ripped into the practice of forced monachization, the fun little game where families just decided for their daughters whether they'd live life in freedom or in a convent. This book was so critical, so intense in its language, that it wasn't published until long after her death. She called out the hypocrisy of her society, how everyone loved to talk about honor and family, yet thought nothing of locking girls up just to dodge a wedding bill. Tarabotti's argument was straightforward. It was for money and control. Men got their freedoms, their education, their big talk about honor, while women got stuffed into convents like some unwanted furniture. Then came The Lament of the Nun, where she took a step further, saying, in not-so-gentle terms, that being a nun against her will was the closest thing to social death. This book is practically dripping with sarcasm, as she tells everyone how wonderful it is to be stripped of personal choice and dignity. She argued that the convent wasn't some holy refuge, but a dumping ground for women who society didn't want to deal with. And she wasn't exactly wrong. These places were filled with young girls who could have done a lot more if anyone had cared to let them. She went after the whole concept of how her society treated women. In The Lament for a Dead Nun, she tackled the absurdity of an education system that conveniently forgot half the population. She mocked the idea that education was for men only, pointing out the irony of a society that celebrated knowledge but barred women from it. Education was a joke when it came to women. If they wanted it, they had to scrape it together in secret or be born into a family that gave a damn. Through her lifetime, Archangela Tarabotti kept hammering the point home that forced monachization was garbage. She wasn't anti-religion, she was anti-BS. She could see through the thin veil of religious duty that covered up what was really just a way to keep women out of sight and out of mind. Her life ended in 1652, still in the convent, still denied the freedom to actually live out the autonomy she fought for. Sister Blandina Segale. Born in Italy in 1850, she jumped into the Wild West like she had some unfinished business there. Because really, what better way for a nun to spend her days than sidestepping bullets and outlaws? Blandina was supposed to be some humble nun in New Mexico, educating kids and doing her holy duty shtick. Instead, she spent her time wrangling with gunslingers and performing what most of us would call occupational hazards for a job that only came with a habit and maybe a rosary. By her early 20s, she found herself in Colorado, trying to bring education to the rough and tumble kids who were more likely to pull a knife than raise their hand. Instead of running away, she rolled up her sleeves and actually talked to these kids, who were just as likely to rob the very school she was trying to run. Then, in 1874, she moved down to Trinidad, New Mexico, where the real chaos began. Blandina wasn't exactly asking for peace and quiet, though. Somehow, her serving the underserved seemed to mean walking right into the middle of shootouts and gang wars. She practically had a seat reserved at the outlaw table, and that wasn't a request. And then Billy the Kid came. Yep, the famous outlaw known for being charming enough to flirt with death on the regular. Blandina crossed paths with him because, of course, he'd end up in her orbit. One day, she heard that Billy's gang wanted to lynch a fellow Italian named Mr. Antone. Did she keep her head down like a normal person? Nope. She showed up right in front of Billy's gang, the poor Italian victim in tow, and basically dared them to do anything about it. Just imagine those idiots standing there, probably scratching their heads wondering what kind of nun strolls up to a bunch of men with guns like she's taking a walk in the park. When the gang didn't shoot her on sight, she realized she could actually talk sense into them. She might as well have said, "Try me." Billy's gang backed down because, apparently, they weren't quite ready to risk a nun's curse on top of whatever legal trouble they had. Incredibly, Sister Blandina convinced Billy to let the guy go. From then on, Billy and his crew started treating her with a certain twisted kind of respect. You've got to admit, there's a certain humor in a gang of outlaws showing professional courtesy to a nun. Of course, maybe even outlaws knew there were limits, but it wasn't just Billy and his merry band of criminals she dealt with. Sister Blandina was a magnet for trouble and could find herself face to face with vigilantes one day, then outlaws the next. She didn't seem fazed when locals would run to her about some lawless nonsense going down. Blandina became the Wild West's unofficial peacekeeper because everyone else seemed useless. Eventually, Blandina became a known figure among the rough types in the West, and nobody dared mess with her. Her hospital was one of the only places around where people could get actual care, and she seemed to be in no rush to leave the chaos behind. She knew what her options were. I don't know about you, but nuns can be badass sometimes as far as these women are concerned.